Um, Welcome everyone to the MAIA webinar on urban ecosystem accounting in the SEEA year with a focus on issues in monetary valuation. My name is David Barton. I'm a researcher in the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. I've been helping to put together the program. And our chair for today is Alejandro Caparros. And I'd like to pass the word on now to Alejandro to tell us briefly about today's program before we start. Thank you.
Yes, hello. We're going to have a webinar until 11:30. So it's going to be David Barton is going to make first an introduction of what we're going to have. Then we will have Colin Smith from DEFRA, Lode Nocker from VITO, Beckert Ekin Burkhard Schwebert from the Germany. And then David Barton will close again. So in principle, the questions, you should hold your questions till the end, but please write them on the chat. I will read them in order of appearance. So I will just read what you have in the chat. So there's no opportunity to intervene here. To be more efficient, we have decided to do it this way. So please just, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to have them, but please put them on the chat and I will read them in the time that we have allocated for this purpose. So I don't know, without any further ado, I just give David Barton the floor. So please go ahead and start with introduction to urban thematic accounts, evaluation, knowledge, and opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thank you very much for that introduction, Alejandro. I'm going to make a brief introduction on some themes and topics for today's webinar. I'm going to introduce the topic of urban thematic accounts and finish with some questions regarding valuation knowledge gaps and opportunities which we observe when we do urban thematic accounts. Why work on urban thematic accounts? Why work on urban ecosystems? Superficially, one might think that this would be the last place to look for green structure or ecosystems. But actually, it may be one of the more important thematic accounts mentioned in the system of environmental economic accounts and ecosystem accounts of the UN, because we know a large and growing proportion of the world's population living in cities. I think it's almost a decade ago that we passed the mark that more than half of the world's population live in cities. We know that cities make a major contribution to the economy, and so understanding and improving the ecosystem's contribution to economies and populations of urban areas is paramount. We also see that there's a great variation, and this figure in the chart is taken from a recent paper in remote sensing. We also see a great variation in how cities are growing. Some are, very few are contracting, and also the type of growth or contraction that they have. And some, in many or most extensifications of cities, the area of vegetation cover is shrinking due to the joint expansion and densification. But a large number of cities are managing to grow while increasing green cover, and a small number of cities are contracting. So this great variation and the economic importance it entails, and the importance of ecosystems, green and blue infrastructure for cities' economies is important to understand, even though it's a small percentage of the land area of a country. On the 5th of March, the UN SEEA Statistics Council Commission approved the final draft of the system of environmental economic accounting for ecosystem accounting. One of the topics of today's seminar is to look at some of the challenges in the chapters on monetary valuation, on complementary approaches to valuation, and on specifically on the thematic accounts, and specifically the subsection on accounting for urban areas. It's important to note that when this document was passed, the first 7 chapters on the biophysical parts of the accounts became a UN standard, but due to continued discussion and knowledge gaps on monetary valuation, the last chapters, including the thematic accounts and complementary approaches, are are discussed as accepted accounting principles, but not yet ripe for standardization. And so it's of interest to research projects such as MAIA to look at how to further and fill the knowledge gaps regarding monetary valuation. And in the context of urban ecosystem accounting, there are a number of challenges, which I'll come on into now. So very briefly, the system of environmental economic accounting, ecosystem accounting, involves 5 main sets of accounts: ecosystem extent, ecosystem condition, biophysical flow and use accounts for ecosystem services, monetary ecosystem service accounts for flow and use, and asset accounts, monetary asset accounts. And the purpose of ecosystem accounting is to have a full coverage of the area, the administrative area or the area of governance. Usually this, because it's connected to national accounting, obviously it would be the nation. But when we move to thematic accounts, the accounting area for which we do this is some definition of an urban or city management area, which doesn't necessarily have to be city limit, but we're in one part of the complex of ecosystem accounts. An important reason to do ecosystem accounting in general and urban ecosystem accounts specifically is that it helps cities and municipal governments to report on the SDGs. Obviously, the most important SDG, the most relevant and immediate, is SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities, but a large number of the SDGs, the other SDGs are relevant, and ecosystem accounts, urban ecosystem accounts, provide the basis for compiling indicators to report on sustainable development goals at the level of cities and municipalities. I mentioned briefly in the introduction that a city or the urban accounting area in thematic urban accounts can vary depending on the need. On the left-hand side, we see variable ways of defining a city based on an example from Oslo. On the right-hand side, we see the definition of functional urban areas used by the European Commission, Eurostat. On the left-hand side, we could, at the most ample extent, we could consider, for example, the commuting area to the metro region of Oslo as a relevant management area, since this is, in a sense, an economic unit supplying labor to the city. The smallest possible extent, which you see in the middle in red, could be simply the built zone within the municipal boundaries, which is also a type of management area where specific types of regulation and zoning exist. And any management area between is also relevant depending on the need and the interest of the government level, for example, county level or regional level. Why would we do urban ecosystem accounts specifically for policy planning and communication purposes in municipalities? Excuse me. Well, there are different interests at different policy needs at different scales. Of course, we're in the urban ecosystem, but at the scale of landscapes within the city, the municipality has a need to develop municipal plans, often at a four-year term, to do zoning of particular land uses within those landscapes. It has an interest in zoning green infrastructure as particular types of assets that need to be managed, blue and green infrastructure, to regulate their use. Oops, sorry. A bit too fast there. Regulate their use, to give permits for development and use of green infrastructure, and also accounts and valuation could be used, for example, in pricing the utilities like water and sewage, and also at the level of damages, for example, to trees. Evaluation of nature-based solutions may also be an interest where data from urban accounts can be used. Urban accounts provide challenges because if they're done for municipalities for the use for urban planning and policy, They have to be done at a very high spatial resolution, which presents challenges not only for the physical accounts, but also for valuation. We see an example of the mapping of tree crowns and tree height on the left-hand side, and the mapping of green cover measured by chlorophyll or NDVI on the right-hand side. The definition of green space and green infrastructure is can be very fragmented. It's not simply parks, there's a lot of interspersed vegetation which is delivering ecosystem services, which should be accounted for. It's worth to dwell a little bit on this regarding different ways of doing biophysical accounting of urban ecosystems. There are fundamentally two ways which can be combined. One is the landscape approach, focusing on typologies for land cover types, which are then the basis for looking at trends and change in land cover types. And another is to focus on individual assets, like vegetation structure. I hope you can switch your microphones off, please. If Nicola could. Nicola could.
Oh, tut mir leid, aber ich wusste, dass der eins.
If you could mute the microphones, thank you. So apologies for that. So I was saying that another approach is to focus on accounting for individual assets. Trees is a typical and important example. And this is because, and it's unusual maybe in the context of ecosystem accounting, assets are what are managed just as much as landscape or land cover types. Municipal governments will be managing the actual structures and allocating funds and maintenance costs for the structures themselves, so they will have an interest in asset accounting specifically. These two approaches are highlighted in chapter 13 of the SEEA. Just briefly, two accounting tables, the one at the top taking the landscape approach, and then the one at the bottom taking an asset approach. And both of these are equally valid depending on the needs, and they can also be combined. Nearing the end now, but I'd like to say that one of the challenges I hope we can bring forth in today's webinar is that there is a certain possible tension, but also complementarity between the needs of national accounts, that is aggregating the trends in all urban areas in a nation at a high spatial scale and maybe a lower resolution, and the need of urban accounts at the municipal level, which are at a lower scale, obviously, and at a higher resolution. There's a differential in resolution and scale, and there's also a difference in the kinds of purposes that national accounts versus municipal level accounts and what they're used for in terms of policy and planning. There's a difference in those purposes which may affect the way we do the biophysical and monetary accounting in themselves. And I hope that this potential for complementarity, but also the possible tensions, will be discussed in today's meeting. Very briefly, we'd like to, at today's meeting, focus on some of the SEEA research and development agendas for monetary ecosystem service accounts. Those are briefly summarized to look at the connections between exchange value-based estimates from the ecosystem accounts and complementary approaches to valuation, such as welfare-based valuation. To look at valuation concepts in different decision-making contexts, considering also the importance of complementary valuation methods, not only the exchange value-based accounting compatible methods, taking into account the location of users and variations in institutional arrangements in the urban area, in particular in this case, how we do value transfer techniques or generalizing values from existing studies to the whole urban accounting area, how we approach the measurement of future flows and prices of ecosystem services as inputs to calculation of net present value for ecosystem asset accounts. Those are the main research agenda items for the SEEA in general. And for urban accounts and specifically, I would say that we can expect during today to hear about the challenges in aligning national statistical organizations, agencies, interests with the municipal government's accounting purposes, the urban accounting and asset boundaries, the fact that we're dealing with highly modified ecosystems, so ecosystem condition is very different from other ecosystems. Restoration, nature-based solutions are important. Height, spatial and temporal resolution, the need for hybrid extent condition accounts because of this high spatial resolution, and particularly for valuation today, the valuation of health being very important in cities, the challenge of valuing municipal services generated by vegetation when these are essentially free, and also the fact that most amenities, green spaces, etc., are open access and not regulated with some kind of access fee, as in national parks maybe. So these are some general challenges for valuation in urban areas that I hope we'll touch on. So that was my introduction, trying to highlight some of today's issues, and we'll just proceed straight to the first presentation without questions on this introduction. Thank you.
It was a little tricky to follow David with his really swish visuals, 3D maps and diagrams and so on. But I hope to give an overview of how we're valuing different services in the UK, developing UK urban accounts. I haven't got time to go into detail, but a sort of walkthrough. I know one or two of the other presentations will probably deep dive into particular valuation methods. And as David's pointed to, the interest of municipal authorities in this, we've got some examples in the UK still at early stages and quite sort of interesting in terms of those tensions and links which David mentioned, and then to draw out some sort of lessons from that and to inform sort of the research agenda and where the knowledge gaps are. I should just say just some sort of personal disclaimers. So I've not developed these accounts. I've sort of had sight of them as they've developed. Our Office of National Statistics are producing all of our natural capital accounts in the UK, and myself and DEFRA and Rocky Harris, some of you may know, have been playing a sort of supporting developmental role, trying to bring a sort of policy perspective as well on the development of the accounts. And also, I've not had first hand of the local authorities' involvement, but I think it's actually something we need to look at to sort of almost formally evaluate what's going on. So this presentation has been a good opportunity to sort of bring some of these different strands together. And I should just say as well, you know, these are experimental. We're learning as we go, and it's an opportunity to learn from others as well as to share our own learning. Why are urban accounts a priority in the UK? Well, the UK is a very urbanised country, particularly England, where policy is devolved. The strategic policy document shown there back to 2018 had a number of sort of policy directions and initiatives related to urban context, health, development, green infrastructure, education, and so on. And we've been developing what we call natural capital account, ecosystem accounts in line with the developing SEEA thinking over recent years. And we were taking what we called a broad habitat approach, so looking at farmland, woodlands, freshwaters, and urban seemed to be very much at the kind of high priority from a sort of policy relevant point of view. And it's although there was lots of information around nationally around sort of urban vegetation, it was very fractured and disconnected and frankly quite partial as well. I won't spend very long at all on this slide, just to put it up in terms of the extent and condition. As David mentions, this is quite tricky. I'm not sure we've cracked it in the UK. The challenge there was to identify sort of all spatial layering of all the built up areas across the country. And for the purposes of the accounts, we've put the researchers put a buffer around those built up areas rather than sort of administrative areas. So I think the idea being that you can sort of track change over time, and that administrative areas may change and so on. In terms of the resolution, there's some tensions between land cover labelling and more functional categories of green space. But essentially, we're talking about, you know, pretty small proportions of the overall land of the UK, about 8%, of which around a third is natural green space. So I'll go into the coverage of ecosystem services. I've got a slide on each of these. Not comprehensive, but as we developed in recent years, started thinking about what an urban account might look like. One of the things we were interested in was to identify what are the key services for urban, which might be different from, say, woodland or farmland or coastal margins. And the regulating services and the cultural services are particularly important here. But there's also this issue about what's feasible, what can we develop relatively quickly with current data, with current models that could be applied nationally. So that kind of tension there, you know, you could develop a national method, but it might not necessarily be really granular. And some of the other services which we didn't focus on potentially can bring into the urban setting. So agricultural, farmland, water supply, abiotic services could potentially be cut to urban. We've yet to, I think, although we have got publications, we've yet sort of really to sort of formally put everything into what might be called an urban account. I think there's a bit more work to do there. The regulating services mentioned are important but challenging. I'll cover some of those, and some of them which I won't be covering, like flood regulation or water filtration, are sort of in hand, as it were, but not in an urban context. Range of valuation methods applying, aiming for sort of exchange value concepts, but there are some grey areas, particularly around the use of damage costs. I won't say anything about condition indicators, but there are things around things like designations and access for cultural services, but there's more that could be done in terms of vegetation, canopy cover, and so on. Okay, provisioning services. The focus here is on urban food production, essentially allotments and community gardens. What's interesting is that within the urban extent, there would also be farmlands, which we've not brought in formally to the urban accounts yet, and that's actually quite important because then it helps you to identify maybe land use trade-offs, and we might realize that actually having farmlands near urban areas is not actually producing very much in the way of ecosystem services, but that's a sort of separate conversation. With urban food production, the survey data has been poor, but actually that's been a blessing in some respects, because it's by the process of doing accounts that you realize what is it you know, what is it you don't know, and then you think, okay, can we develop methods and repeatable methods? And ONS gradually are then changing their data collection and their surveys to feed into the accounts, so that you get to this sort of virtuous circle, which I think has been a good lesson. Without going into too much detail, so the kind of first approximation, UNICEF uses satellite data to estimate a number of these plots, and then applying from the literature some average values on yields and size and so on. So we get an output value of around £300 million a year. I will show up some valuations, but sort of smoke but don't inhale. We haven't really got time to go into the kind of nitty-gritty of how those numbers are generated. But David made an interesting point about rental values, which is ideally what you would like, I think, for something like urban food production, and allotment values, rental values may be quite low. If we took a resource rent approach, you'd get a lower value than the output value. But there's a question about, you know, is it the same as agriculture, given the sort of recreational and labour input which is involved in urban food production in the UK? So sort of outstanding questions there. Carbon sequestration is sort of more straightforward. Focus here is on urban woodland. So we've got values for the overall country, and then that's cut to the urban area. Relatively stable over time on the left-hand side, but the value's rising over time on the right-hand chart. And here we use a standard valuation approach for valuing carbon reductions or sequestration, which is geared to government targets. So it's a target consistent price, effectively a kind of replacement cost for government, valuing a ton of carbon. And it's rising each year to link to reflecting the Kyoto targets. Air pollution removal is probably the best example, where we've developed a model nationally, a dynamic transport model of air pollution with and without vegetation, which is then can be disaggregated at relatively fine scales including the urban extent. So you get a nice consistency there. There's different pollutants which give different results. The big ones are particulate matter, which has disproportionate impact. What's interesting here is that we found that the actual reductions in urban areas, at least, are pretty small in terms of the physical ecosystem service. That's partly because reflecting the limited vegetation in urban areas and the extent of pollution. But nevertheless, that has a high value because the ecosystem is working hard. And not only is it working hard, but there's lots of beneficiaries to benefit from that hard work. So that's quite interesting, and the figures aren't small. They're valued in terms of avoided health costs, although there's a grey area there in terms of these are sort of damage costs, which may have a welfare element, and we'll need to be looking at this again. So the modelling is in need of updating. It also projects trends into the future as well, but that's air pollution removal. Temperature regulation is another interesting one, which was kicked off by our desire to develop and scope an urban account. Again, a similar process where could we develop a method nationally? Ideally, you would have a national model. You would have remote sensing and so on to identify, with and without vegetation, what air temperatures are like. All these things are quite expensive and time consuming. So sort of first approximation was to identify using coverage of blue and green space and looking at the literature, and then assuming averaging air temperature reductions across urban areas. It's quite simplistic, but disaggregated across 11 city regions. First of all, to identify what these cooling effects are, so less than 1 degree Celsius, which may not seem much, but actually when you've got hot days, so defined as over 28 degrees, that can make a difference to productivity and to a smaller extent air conditioning costs. So there's a nice link there to averted benefit loss, negative of an air, reducing a negative again. So construction, but other forms of economic activity. There's a sort of production function type of link there. And the map shows you how frequent the hot days were, I think in 2015, 2017. And what's interesting here is that, it's the south of the country, the southeast of the country, which has the hottest spells. And that's also the most productive part of the country. So this is actually an important regulating service. The second interesting thing we've learned from this is that the value will vary each year because the number of hot days will vary. In 2018, we had a very long heat wave, so the service was doing more. And about 80 to 90% of those UK values, I think, are attributable to London. So crude, but disaggregated and insightful, and something that we can build on and refine. Noise regulation is something that there's a lot of it's sort of in the literature, I think, but in terms of developing this kind of repeatable model of challenge, I won't say very much about this because it's quite difficult and it's perhaps not as important, although our researchers have done quite a lot of testing using very detailed spatial data in Greater Manchester to identify the effect of vegetation on road traffic noise, and then modelling that spatially with benefiting residents. The key here is location is everything, and it's only effective working in that kind of linear way. The values are relatively small, in the tens of millions rather than the hundreds of millions, and we are continuing to explore different methods to sort of scale that up nationally, or to apply national methods in a way which you can use open data. Ideally, you would have a bit like air pollution, noise maps, and then you would add in vegetation, and you'd see the difference. You would subtract vegetation and see the difference. Okay, moving on. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I better hurry up. Cultural services, very important. This chart just shows you that half of the time spent out in the outdoors in this country is in urban areas. So that's really significant and is a leading indicator of the importance of the ecosystem service. It's been growing over time in the left-hand chart. And in terms of valuing this service, I mean, we've gone around the houses on this, pardon the pun. But a sort of core element of the valuation is looking at out-of-pocket expenditure, travel and entry costs. It's pretty crude, but the data's there, and a kind of pseudo quasi exchange value. But that's not the only benefit, because that's only capturing the out-of-pocket expenditure. Those who are living locally to parks have got sort of free trips, walking the dog and so on. That can be picked up in house price data, which I'll come onto in the next chart. So ONS have done a lot of really high-tech work on hedonic pricing to identify the impact of property prices systematically across the country, where they're depending on proximity to green and blue space. And the headline is that on average, there's a 1 to 2% premium on homes within a few hundred meters of accessible green and blue space. So the idea is by living near a park, buying or renting a house, you are effectively paying a sort of a season ticket, a membership ticket to have low or zero cost to access. And then the associated capital values are translated into annual rentals. There's also a visual amenity element, which they were able to pick up in the data through some machine learning technique, which I certainly don't know anything about. So the idea that if you actually can see green space, or if you can see blue space, that's reflected in house prices, and that's not trivial either. Also, health's important here, and this hasn't been formally integrated, but we know that a proportion of these visits to green space are physically active, and we have conversion factors, or researchers have come up in the UK with conversion factors into quality adjusted life year metrics, which can be valued in two ways, either as a welfare basis, which would be double counting, but we also have data on the average sort of spending that health providers do to deliver one quality adjusted life year. So you've effectively got a replacement cost there, which can give a sense of the kind of what nature is supporting in terms of health provision. And I think these values are additional because they're exchange values and they're separate beneficiaries. But there are some tricky issues around causality and additionality. Okay, I'm sorry, it's a really quick race through, but I wanted just to go into some of the sort of local applications. But just standing back for a moment, pie chart there just shows the division of some of the values I've been talking about. Cultural services do dominate, in a sense, as we'd expect, but regulating services can be significant and possibly increasingly significant into the future. Health benefits are significant, although, as I said, they're sort of indicative at the moment. And the sense of multifunctionality that, you know, there is this range of services that are provided. And when you add them all up, I mean, we're not talking trivial values here, you know, several billion a year. And in terms of the work we've done across the UK on all our natural capital assets, okay, it's partial, but the urban areas are definitely punching above their weight. So if you just look at the urban green space as a proportion of UK land area, it's around 2 to 3%, but it's 10 times that in terms of its contribution to the overall asset value. So we've certainly been pushing this in national policy making, and I think it's also given a lead to local accounting initiatives. Although I think it's probably fair to say that over recent years there have been separate drivers for what's been called natural capital accounting at the UK municipal level. But what's interesting is that some of these accounts in our major cities have used some of these national methods. There is some local variation as well. Greater Manchester, for example, has developed a natural capital account. There's a sort of infographic on the right across its region. And the idea here is that, you know, the account provides to the policymakers, to those in charge of developing strategies, a baseline value, and as they state here, so we currently know what we've got in order to monitor benefits over time. It's a little bit sort of vague, but it's very much a starting point, and it's linked with a lot of other activity in the kind of green infrastructure space that Greater Manchester are doing. So that's an interesting one to watch. Greater London Authority produced a natural capital account, as they called it, back in 2017, I think. So a similar time to when we were developing our own accounts, disaggregated by London Borough. And a key point coming across here is that the importance of green infrastructure, green space as an economic asset that gives good value to Londoners, not simply just a liability where people just know the cost. You know, on balance sheets, there'll be the cost of park maintenance, but there won't be anything to offset that in terms of the benefits. So people look at it and say, well, what is it delivering? Well, this account says it's delivering £27 for every pound spent. And we can argue about, you know, the robustness of those numbers, but that seems quite an important message. More recently, Liverpool City Region have developed a very detailed, what they call a natural capital baseline, but is essentially an account. There's extent and detailed mapping and service valuation to identify particular needs and where there might be what needs to be protected, but also trying to link this to achieving net environmental gain through development, it seems. So that's interesting, bringing together the biophysical, the spatial, and the valuation. There are other examples as well. So all the parks in England have been given a sort of natural capital account drawn from our UK work, and that has been put forward as a sort of business case to local authorities in England, Birmingham City Council, and others as well. So lots going on. It's sort of tantalising in terms of the potential policy relevance. I've mentioned the idea of nature being an asset, not a liability, and these softer gains of sort of understanding and multifunctional, you know, that there are measurable benefits here, I think shouldn't be underestimated. But that's on the left-hand side, I think, of David's chart. The challenge is kind of, you know, moving right there to make these things more maybe operational, more kind of traction. And exchange values can be useful here because they can point to potential savings, for example, if you're valuing replacement costs. Welfare values give you bigger numbers generally and can inform business cases. Certainly, business cases, cost benefit analysis in the UK government would use welfare values, and there's lots of funding pots and streams in that the local authorities kind of bid into. So that's a source. And as David mentioned, there's these kind of longer term kind of strategic planning, you know, making room for new development and COVID recovery and all those sorts of things, identifying investment priorities. And there's, you know, national policy drivers around biodiversity, net gain from development, nature recovery strategies, green infrastructure standards. So all these things can increase the demand, I think, for accounting. Having said that, on the other hand, you know, accounts, they only give a baseline. They need to be repeated, and it's not entirely clear if some of these local authorities are just seeing this as sort of a one-off study just to provide big numbers, or actually really going to institutionalize these accounts. They don't themselves provide a cost-benefit analysis of a specific investment, but they can become the basis for that. There's also the challenges about proving to people who want to see the hard cash, the hard benefits, how the investment in green infrastructure will give you savings. There is some commonality amongst some of the methods and concepts. I think that's partly because of what we've been doing at national level, partly because some of the same people are working on different accounts. So there's a kind of a tension there between plurality, innovation, but also commonality between different local levels as well as between national and local. And then just coming to the end now, perhaps a bigger issue really is that you know, accounts at that kind of local level, that end of the telescope, may be seen as sort of one of several tools and approaches. So yes, when people talk about evidence, they don't necessarily think about accounts. They might think, okay, we've got monitoring to do, we've got business cases to write, we're doing these mapping exercises, we've got these one-off studies and valuation tools. And in a sense, the great value added of accounts is, you know, you're not starting necessarily with a blank sheet of paper, but you can bring a lot of this together into a coherent whole where the biophysical and the valuation is brought together, and indeed then to sort of more systematically identify gaps for investing in data and methods. So accounts, in a sense, is a double-edged sword. They have these kind of multifunctional benefits of economies of scale and scope, so to speak. But by the same token, there's a need to have that kind of upfront investment. And, you know, it may be that, you know, a lot of these decision makers, they're in a hurry. Do they want to, you know, do they want to make that upfront strategic investment? And that's where national government needs to give a lead and make it as easy as possible, I think, so that some of these methods can be transferable. Okay, so just final slide then. I'm conscious I've sort of skated over quite a lot, but I'll keep to time. So UK accounts still evolving, a lot to do on extent, condition and services. There's going to be hopefully a substantive update next year. Those of you interested can email the team at ONS. They're going to do a stakeholder survey before they develop the next stage of accounts. Some of the valuation methods I've touched upon are reasonably established, others experimental. A key point seems to me is that, going back to the sort of SEEA and standards and so on, that actually the biophysical measurement is as difficult as the valuation. You know, because we've got standard values, government values, sort of damage or replacement cost values for things like carbon, pollution, air pollution, noise. I mean, in a sense, they're easy. You just need to know what the what change it is you need to, what's the difference you need to value biophysically. So for regulating services, the biophysical is the real challenge. There's a lot of experimentation going on there. I think at national level and at local level, there's a need for more join up with sort of separate autonomous mapping and monitoring and indicator initiatives. And that's a slow process. One thing we haven't touched upon is particularly interesting since COVID, lockdowns and so on, you know, inequalities and who benefits, who are the users of these services. The other thing I haven't touched upon, which I think is still a research gap, is thinking about the future trends. Once you've got a method, then you can identify what the key variables are and see how they might project over time. But with things like climate change adaptation and so on, that becomes quite important going forward. And the other thing I think in a kind of policy sense, which there is a challenge, is that kind of link with a more kind of dynamic economic growth agenda. So even if you had the perfect ecosystem account, it gives you a snapshot of your services, but how is that translating through to productivity, jobs, local growth, and so on? And it may be that accounts just can't answer that question. And then I think just coming back really to one of David's final points, actually, there's a sort of challenge and opportunity here, you know, to develop methods that can be easily scaled up, scaled down spatially. To the extent that national accounts can supply local accounting needs, that's great. But there's also maybe a two-way process where you can get, you know, innovative methods which can then be scaled up nationally. None of this comes cost-free, so you know, it's an ongoing challenge. But I think we've been making good progress, and see the cup as sort of a third full rather than 2/3 empty. Okay, I'll stop there.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. You have few questions, and they are basically, can group them together in air pollution and temperature regulation. We have a couple of them on that. Lina Koperoinen asked how to take into account the counter effects of vegetation around city streets in air filtration services. Studies carried out by Heikki Sitale et al. In Finland have shown that trees and other vegetation can actually also decrease the air quality at street level for pedestrians. Okay, she says it's tricky. So also, Carmina also wanted more details on the air pollution. Maybe you can comment.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that. Yeah, I agree. We've got an air quality expert group who looked into this at city level, and it can be mixed. It does depend on a lot of very sort of micro factors. You know, if you've got a sort of tunnel of trees in a street, they can actually trap the pollutants in. So that the modelling that we did was, but our researchers did, was national. And so it's slightly that broader scale. So, for example, that London's air quality benefits from, you know, there's a lot of woodland to the southwest of London, for example, and this kind of the kind of dynamic transport element of that gets picked up. But yeah, there comes a point with any modelling that, you know, at such a finer scale, other things start to crowd out. So it is a tricky one, and you know, I think, you know, we shouldn't jump to the conclusions that somehow, you know, tree planting is going to solve the problem. But it depends what proportion of your, you know, if there's only a tiny proportion of the area where of urban areas with trees, then there can be scope for improving that service. But yeah, these still quite broad brush, and I think there's no substitute for kind of proper design type guidance in terms of kind of the actual operational delivery of these things based on the sorts of science and counter effects and that's mentioned.
Thank you. So the other question we had was from David Barton and Graciela Roche, both from Nina. They were concerned about urban heat island reduction and the impact of climate change in the future. Of course, even though we have the Paris Agreement, but still climate change, we know it's going to happen. So what is going to be the scope for modeling this increase, the importance of this, the increase of this service, the increase of the importance of this service in the future?
Yeah, so that's a good one. I didn't touch upon sort of the future trends. So we in the first phase, we tried to get them say, okay, so we've got these numbers of hot days where there's 10, 15, 20 hot days a year in urban cities. What's that going to look like in 2070? We've got climate projections. There's another assessment coming out in the UK soon, and so they were built into the initial asset valuation. So you've definitely got an upward trend. This is not about flatlining, and I think that's a really valuable insight, actually. That, you know, a service may be smaller now, but into the future, it becomes more valuable, and that's what an asset value is trying to capture. It's not trying to capture the here and now, but it's capturing everything going forward. And as SEEA says, it's kind of your best expectation of the service going forward, and for climate change adaptation, that's certainly a priority to get that into the service. Other regulating services, I haven't talked about sort of urban flood regulation. That's where it becomes very heterogeneous spatially and dependent on so many topographical and contextual factors. It becomes very difficult to do that at any sort of scale. That could be growing in the future. Air pollution removal is interesting because background pollution levels are falling, and with policy, so in a sense there might be less for the ecosystem to do there.
So thank you very much for your nice presentation and the question and answers. We still have more questions going on noise reduction, etc. But I think maybe it's time to try to move on.
Yeah, maybe you could pick them up afterwards. And also, I should have added a link to the ONS Natural Capital Counts webpage. So if you send the slides around afterwards with the others, I'm happy to update, Nicola.
That is very nice. So now then our next speaker is Leo De Nocker from VII. So please go ahead.
Okay, so I will give you an overview of how, in the context of a pilot project on natural accounting in Flanders, Belgium, we try to look at the health benefits from urban green space. And basically, we looked at issues that are very complementary to what Mr. Collins just presented for the UK. So the reason we did that was also to try to be complementary to what's going on in the international research fields. So the case study is at the regional scale in Flanders, Belgium, but it should be noticed that we focus basically on all urban green spaces in cities and villages urban in context of Flanders, you may be aware of that we don't have very big cities on the one hand, and on the other hand, also our rural areas are densely populated compared to some other countries in Europe. As I said before, it was in the context of a pilot project where health benefits were one of the 5 pilots. And we started in Flanders from the we started with the identification of the needs of potential users of these accounts. So we brought together land use planners who were interested in that information, who really wanted to know what's the importance of location, size, and use of green spaces, and how can we account for health benefits into that context. We had also managers of public green areas who were much more interested in how should we design parks, what kind of, how should we design our paths and so on. But on the other hand, we also had people from the Public Health Agency who were looking in the context of modernizing prevention health policies in Belgium. And they were interested, should we take into account the role of open blue-green spaces in the context of prevention, as we start to do for things like other immunity, environmental immunity issues like, for instance, air quality. So should we pay attention to that? Is there a strong scientific basis for that? And then we also had the Department of Environment who were looking for indicators, for instance, in the context of the greening of the economy. So we had quite a wide range of different people. And it should be noted that we brought these people together before COVID. And now after COVID, as probably is the case in many more countries, the importance of green areas in cities for health and for people and for stress release has been stressed even more. So perhaps I should explain also a bit what we understand with health benefits. When we say health benefits, we look at the avoided physical and mental illnesses as we see them in the health outcomes, and in addition also to impact on mortality and longer life expectations. Green space, in the end, we worked with indicators that refer to the percentage of green area in total land use in 1 to 3 kilometers around the place of residence in a city or in a village. Green areas in our definition also includes all kinds of green land use, including parks, but forest agricultures, but also private gardens. It also includes very small informal green areas, also street trees, for instance, and it also includes surface waters. And we think in contact with green space, we think in context of exposure, which can cover a wide range of different uses. It may include very active contexts, like in context of recreation and doing sports or exercising, but it may also be just sitting on a bench and having view on green. It may be for children playing in a green area. It should also be noticed that in the previous presentation, the benefits of, for instance, capture of air pollutants by urban trees was mentioned, or noise removal. We are talking here on impacts of contact with nature, which are in addition to these impacts. It's being corrected for when I present numbers later on, the benefits you may get from that trees remove air pollutants and so on. A third element, and I will go much more in detail than that a bit later, is that the benefits, they include on the one hand avoided healthcare costs, like costs for hospitalization, but also productivity gains and welfare gains in terms of less suffering or life years gains. So, and that's one of the big lessons we learned, and I'll give you the numbers later, but you can already think now, who will benefit the most from all these urban greens? Will it be the health system? Will it be the economy in terms of productivity gains? Or will it be the people in terms of welfare gains? So it's up to you now to make an estimate who you think will benefit the most. And if you stay until the end, I will give you the answer. In terms of, you may be well aware of what national accounting, the different accounts we're producing, extent accounts, quality accounts, looking at the physical accounts, supply and use accounts, and then monetary accounts. And we try to start from extent accounts up to monetary accounts, also doing physical accounts. And to that, we looked into literature that basically that gives information about scientific literature, percentage of green areas, or sorry, and the quality of the these green areas, how population deals with these green areas, how that affects health outcomes. Typically, you will have impacts in number of, for instance, cases of certain morbidity being a physical morbidity or a mental morbidity per year per habitant. And then we will look at who benefits from a reduction of these health outcomes in the monetary accounts. It should be noted that also we are dealing perhaps more with health accounting than just natural capital accounting, because health impacts they're an important part of cultural ecosystem services, but they also have some overlaps with other elements that were, for instance, mentioned in the previous presentation when it comes to recreation, because when people go to take a walk in a park, they do it because they want to, get the health benefits from restoration. And do we already account for it when we look into the impacts of recreation? But on the other hand, they're also quite different from it because it are different people that may benefit from it. Not just the people who do the recreation, but also the healthcare system or the economy at large, as I will explain later. It also is, in addition, but distinct from impact of green areas on the real estate values, which have who basically are market prices, but are also, in that case, if you plant a forest, the benefits will go to the owners of the real estate, and so you will have different beneficiaries and different bases of quantification, assessment, and of valuation. So they're distinct, but there's some overlap. It's also to be noted that health outcomes, we look at outcomes, not necessarily outputs, so which may be rather complementary than inside national accounting. And also it gives some challenges in how to present these benefits. Typically, it's easy if there is a change in land in the percentage of green area or the quality of green area between two years, so it's easy to present these benefits, but otherwise it's quite a challenge. Often it's being done, and I will give also some examples of that, is to show the difference in health outcomes between people that live in areas that are rich in green, typically the upper and the lower quintile of areas with high and low percentage of green in total land use. So the start of it was what's the usefulness of these or lessons learned for municipal policy and planning. The first thing, I think, we did a very thorough review of scientific literature, which is really booming in recent years, and that confirmed that there is give a very strong scientific evidence that there is a large impact of a large number of mental and physical morbidity health outcomes and for mortality. And there are different mechanisms that explain these impacts. Basically, a lot of these impacts refer to stress release thanks to contact with green areas. And that means that it's definitely in addition to what benefits you may get from just exercising in green areas. So that's quite important. As was mentioned before in the UK, where it was the benefits of exercising in green areas were accounted for. This has a broader context and also includes much more passive use of green areas, like just having the view on that. It also showed that there is a strong evidence for it, and that the impact is significant. If you look into it, the total number of all the health outcomes that are being affected, they are important. I think it's if you count for it in terms of the quality of life indicators, that for half of the impacts, if you quantify these in terms of disability life years or healthy life years, then half 50% of the morbidity impacts may be affected to a smaller or a larger way by contact with green areas. And also, if you translate it into monetary impacts, as I will do later, it's maybe the benefits may be in the area of 1% of GDP, so it's quite significant. So this was also important for like people from health prevention to know, okay, these are important issues to look at. But there are also limitations to it, because the current state of the scientific evidence does not give really clear indicators what will be the health benefits if you adapt the quality or the conditions of these green areas. So the best indicator we could find is percentage of green area in total land use, up in around 1 to 3 kilometer place of residence, but that's a very rough proxy. And so typically the land use planners or urban green managers, they were a bit disappointed, because they were really looking for kind of what is the benefit of if I create one additional path in my park, for instance, or if I change the plan, if I add more biodiversity and things like that. But I will show later that I think, nevertheless, once, because you have an overall framework, that there's also some literature that these people can build upon to improve the quality and what we call in natural capital accounting, the conditions of the green areas. So basically, what did we do? We, as I said before, we reviewed the scientific literature, which provided strong scientific evidence for public health benefits. But on the other hand, it was that literature was very good to indicate there is a benefit, but it did not allow to really take into account the quality of the environment. So in the end, the indicator we used is percentage of green area around the place of residence. But still, accounting for that requires very detailed land use maps and information about the place of residence. And especially if you want to compare, for instance, yearly changes into that, you need a consistent interpretation of land use map of different years. And the tests we did showed that that's also quite challenging. So typically we looked, again, if you look into the stepwise approach, we looked in literature and we found that there's strong evidence in literature that uses indicators in percentage of green area and health outcomes. The studies that used also information on quality or the use of these green environments in health outcomes, that literature was much more diverse, and it was hard to draw conclusions of that literature. As I said before, in terms of extents, we use land use maps. For Belgium, we did it on a very detailed level at 10 to 10 meters. And this gives an example. This is Antwerp from a rougher approach. But if you look into detail, then you see that also in a historical city, there's a lot of green within the city center. And this allowed us to indicate, but I don't know whether it's very visible, but this is the percentage of green into 1 kilometer around a place. And on average, that's in Belgium, 73% of the area is indicated as a green area. But on the other hand, and 10% of the people have less than 50%. And basically for policymakers, the people are especially interested in how can we improve the situation of people living here. And one way to express also the benefits is what are the differences in health outcomes between people living here and people that have more green. And this is around 20% of green areas in land use. So what are the health outcomes of that? One way to express that is to look at what are the benefits in health indicators of 10% more green areas. And you see here, we look into morbidity, mortality, and then you see that for mental health impacts like anxiety disorders and depressions, which are issues, especially now in COVID times, we're very concerned about, and which are quite big in Belgium, you see that 10% more green areas has an impact of -4 to -5% on these health outcomes. So if I compare again that somebody who's in this situation or in this situation, he may have a difference of 10% for mental health outcomes. When it comes to important physical health impacts for morbidity like coronary heart diseases, diabetes, or heart failure, impact is lower, but it's still significant. So overall, by people with a 20% or more green area around them can have importance of up to 10% differences in both more important morbidity outcomes, both for mental health and physical health, and also in terms of life expectancy and mortality. And these are important in terms of the overall burden of disease. So we think that the importance of the provision of green areas for Belgium may be around almost 10% if you aggregate in disability life years, which is one way to summarize different health impacts. So this confirms that health impacts from green areas are important in physical terms. In a next step, we looked at what are the monetary benefits from these health outcomes, looking to how does it impact health costs using cost of illness data for Belgium, or it also showed that we also needed to rely on European country studies, for instance. In this case, the beneficiaries are the healthcare sector, mostly, and to some extent also the patients. We also looked at the impact on the economy in terms of avoided absenteeism, where we build also on literature for Belgium and Europe. In this case, the beneficiaries are industries and services. And third, we looked at the welfare gains for the people and their families, which looks at willingness to pay studies for valuation of morbidity and life years lost. And overall, as I said before, it's an important benefit, adding up to 1% of GDP. But one of the interesting things is also that we could estimate which are the important categories. And whereas there's always a lot of discussion about what are the impacts, for instance, on the consumers, on the using willingness to pay studies, our calculations showed that, in fact, the biggest beneficiary of all that green is the economy, so the industry and the service sector, thanks to avoided absenteeism, because a lot of these health impacts result in absenteeism from work, and that's half of the economic benefit. I think that's an important lesson from our study. Also the healthcare system benefits a lot. It's 36% of these total benefits. And to put all things in perspective, in Belgium, we spend about 10% of our GDP goes to healthcare. If we can reduce that to something like perhaps up to a few percentage, if we can gain something in health benefits, that will have a huge impact on healthcare costs. And willingness to pay studies and the benefit from the beneficiaries may be very sometimes controversial also when we discuss it. But in the end, given the overall economic picture, it is important for the people, but it may not dominate the total figures, and less than it may dominate sometimes the discussion on these figures. Also, in terms of, if we look at the benefits per hectare of different land use categories, we see that it's rather important, with on average more than 3,000 euros per year per hectare, which is a significant use of these urban green areas. These are illustrations of how you can use these numbers. So what is the final evaluation and priorities for further research? I think we showed that that calculation showed that it's possible to estimate the health impacts from contact with nature, and they partially overlap but are distinct from recreation and the impact of green areas on real estate values, and they relate very much and build upon data of health accounting. Of course, they would as a priority, we would need more research on what's the impact of contact with urban green nature and health outcomes. And one of the important things is that we would need much more consistent indicators on to categorize urban green and contact with urban green, because now there's such wide range of different indicators that you can have different individual studies, but it's hard to summarize and find common conclusions from different studies. But overall, I think the conclusion was that there's a framework to estimate these impacts, which allows basically us, we get more evidence to improve that. And I want to show two concrete examples of how it has been used. One is, this is a recent screenshot of the Belgian or the Flanders administration agency of public health. I'm sorry, it's in Dutch, but it's their agency. And you see that within the context of prevention policies, they now really take into account to healthy public space, and provision of green areas starts to become part of prevention policy in Belgium. And we have a very performing public health service in Belgium, but prevention is weak. That has been showed in a lot of reviews, and this is part of that modernization of prevention policy. A second thing is I want to end with that, is that there's a lot of studies also about the quality of or the conditions of these green areas with impacts on health outcomes. And but we don't know a lot also on how people behave in that green areas. But and there's a lot of room of improvement there. I think the best data come from the UK MAIA research, where they did long-term reviews of how people engage with the natural environment in the UK. And recent studies show that people also indicate that health, exercise, that's an important motivation for them for their contact and also for exercising and walking in green areas. And one way that it shows that where people were asked, I think 10 years ago, why they would walk the dog, they would say it is for the health benefits of their dog. And if they ask it today why people are doing a daily exercise in a green area, they say that it's for their own health benefit. And this shows that over time, people change their behavior, like they have much more contact with green areas, and health also is an important motivation. And that shows that there's also a link that people in the street really can kind of grasp what we try to grasp here in our national accounts.
Leo, maybe it's time to conclude, if possible, so that we can move on to the questions. Okay, this was my last slide. I wanted to end with that that statement. Okay, perfect then. Perfect timing. So yes, we have a couple of questions, some more technical, some more policy oriented. So Kaya Oras asked about for the evaluation of some services, model use landscape classes, while other services the urban assets. How to construct total service supply. Please give your opinion on what is an elementary spatial unit for ecosystem service supply, quantification, valuation, aggregation from the viewpoint of SEEA. So it's what is the elementary spatial unit, whether it should be assets or it should be landscapes, basically. Opinion on that?
It's a difficult question. So at this moment we so I go back to a slide. It's it basically there are other land use specialists who try to categorize on a very detailed scale what type of land use it is, and whether it's can be considered green or not. And I think it's clear land use is a starting point, but in the end we also want to know both, not only just what's the land use, but also what's the landscape, how attractive is it. And we are building now on condition accounts that give that information. And I think in the context of natural capital accounting, land use is a start for the extent, but then you need a lot of additional information, which we would consider as condition accounts. I think information about how it can be used, how does it look like, because these are also important to follow up, because it's much easier to change these conditions, I think, with good policy than it is to change actual land use, especially in an urban context where there is a high competition for land.
Thank you. So we also have a set of questions basically from David Brasfield, also supported by Lina Koperoinen, and actually David has a very similar question. So the question is, so there is it's inspiring to see the work with knowledge development and methodologies presented in this webinar. But the question is, if the value of this work is not realized until municipalities and private sectors operationalize it. So they want to know whether there is you can talk about this gap between knowledge and actions and suggest how to close it, and asking also if researchers are actually doing enough to close this gap. In the same line, David Barton asks if there are any arguments that we can use to encourage municipalities to have regular funding of accounts rather than ad hoc studies. If you can comment on that, would be great.
It really depends, I think, on the type of user we're talking about. I'll go back, sorry, to the first slide where I said who are the potential users of the results in Belgium. And I think for the people at a more regional scale who are giving the context of for land use planning, and who are giving also the mandate and often also the financial means to managers of public urban green areas, they find a lot of support in our work because they have to fight for every hectare of green space or blue-green space, especially in an urban context where there's a lot of competition for land use, and economic operators are asking basically for the transformation of green area into areas where they say have a bigger economic use, and they can show it's that's the first thing in their discussion. They can use these data to say it's for the benefit of the economy and the importance of the economy that there is enough and green space and of high quality. That's an important thing. I don't think that the local managers of the urban green areas, when they want to make decisions of how the landscape should look like, that they can, with the current state, that they can already use these numbers, I think, but it offers a framework. And second, I think when it comes to health, it's also important, I think, that, and we start to see that now, that both the administrations, but also the practitioners, they see the importance of contact with nature, and they also almost go to what's actually happening, it is to make sure that all provisions like hospitals, but also schools, that they have enough nearby nature to ensure that daily contact with nature. They also prescribe contact with nature in the context of healthcare healthcare provision for people who are ill, especially with mental illness. So these are already practical applications, and that also poses challenges to local authorities and local land use planners and local managers of green areas to provide the accessibility and design of small and bigger local green areas to account for these new demands.
So thank you very much. We have a lot of other questions, but we don't have time, unfortunately. We have very little time for question and answers. So I would suggest that we move on to the coffee break.
Yeah. Let me start with the first slide. And let me say something about the objective of the method we used, the methodology and the services captured, and the background. The background was that we tried to find a methodology that is able to express on the available data we have the monetary value of urban green. And when we decided on this method, it was in 2014. And you can imagine that lots of things have changed in the meantime. But we also look for ways to express our values in a way that it is compatible with SNA, with SEEA, and compatible with exchange values. And another objective of this study was that it should be more or less German-wide on existing data. And further, we want to compare two different methods for valuing urban green. The standard method, which is hedonic pricing for amenity values based on the prices of houses, dependent on their location with regard to urban green. And on the other side, life satisfaction method, which looks at the effect of urban green on the life satisfaction of people living there, and gives the possibility to calculate this life satisfaction to income, and thus into something that could be also explained as exchange values. What kind of ecosystem services do we capture with this method? It is not only visual amenities. SEEA speaks of not only amenities, but visual amenities. It's more than visual amenities. It is also recreation-related services. It is noise attenuation. It is local climate regulation. It is air filtration. What it is rather likely not, I don't think it captures water flow regulation of urban green. But all other services are more or less captured by both of these methods, by hedonic pricing as well as life satisfaction analysis. Therefore, the question we still have to answer is how to allocate the calculated one value for urban green the different services. And I come to this question on the last slide. Yeah, the physical indicator we used, a very simple physical indicator, is the same, more or less the same as the one used in Belgium. And it is even less than that. In 2014 we had no very reliable information on private gardens, but only reliable information on publicly accessible urban green. So our indicator is the share of urban green, publicly accessible urban green within 1 kilometer of residence. And also roadside trees could not yet be considered, but we have now also rather good information about roadside trees. The way we calculate the value then, we add it up, is shown on the right side. For each 100 meter census grid, where we know what the number of people living there, it is calculated the share of green space within 1 kilometer radius. And this is done for everyone living in Germany, or at least in the functional urban areas in Germany. And then the values for each of these persons are added up to a total value of each hectare. The more relevant methodology we use is a so-called life satisfaction analysis, and I don't know if everyone knows what this is. Step one of the life satisfaction analysis is a statistical analysis with a multiple regression function between life satisfaction on the one hand, measured with a Likert scale, here between 0 and 10, and income, age, family status, education, subjectively assessed health, etc., etc., and also with green space supply. The red, the dark, the black variables are used every year. Every year, 30,000 people are asked for these information, life satisfaction on the one hand, and income, age, etc. on the other hand. But we added then also the green space supply as an additional explaining variable to these sets of variables. Then you get the relation between green space supply on the one hand and life satisfaction on the other hand. But you have also, with the same multiple regression, also the relation between income and life satisfaction. And then on that basis, you can translate life satisfaction, the additional life satisfaction by green space supply with additional life satisfaction by more income. And thus gives you the possibility to express green space supply as income equivalent. It's a certain price, additional income. The hedonic pricing approach is based on market pricing. It works also with a statistical analysis with a multiple regression function, but not between life satisfaction, but price for housing on the one hand side, and the flat size, the age of the house, the district on the other side. And we also added green space supply as an additional variable. And then the regression coefficient for green space supply is considered to be, that's relevant. Every literature about this method says that it gives back a lower bound of the value of the price of the ecosystem service provided here by 1 hectare urban green space, a lower bound. And it's interesting to see how low is the lower bound. The hedonic pricing analysis was done for Cologne only, but Cologne is a rather normal city, and therefore we thought that we can translate the results from there to also the rest of the, transfer it to the rest of the German area. But the life satisfaction approach was done for the whole area of the functional urban areas in Germany, and this covers 60 million people from 80 million living in Germany. So the great bulk of the population in Germany was covered by this study. And here you see the differences between the two methods. The differences in value. Value of an additional hectare urban green within 1 kilometer around the residence. And life satisfaction found values up to about 350 euro per year, and hedonic pricing only about 20 euro per year. This is a great difference, you can imagine. To explain these differences on the one hand, and also to have an unbiased estimation based on life satisfaction, well, because there can be a bias in it. We applied a microeconomic simulation model, taking into account market imperfections, equity preferences. What does it mean? It does mean that the landlord must not take all of what the value of green space is. I want to have also something of it. I don't want to pay everything, so that the net value for me is nothing. That is the idea of equity preferences in a competitional market. Market imperfections, equity preferences, and transaction cost. The problem with the life set is that are typical problems. The last 3 problems I mentioned are typical problems of hedonic pricing. And the problem of life satisfaction is that if there are heterogeneous preferences between the people that are not only based on income, but only based on what their idea of a good living with green space around them are, if these are heterogeneous, then it is likely that there is a distribution of preference groups alongside green space supply. And such correlation between these 2 variables would lead to an overestimation of life satisfaction, of values found with life satisfaction. Okay, what are the, as we found, unbiased results? And first, we found that there are reasonable levels with this simulation level reasonable levels of market imperfections, equity preferences, and transaction costs that are can really explain these vast differences between the two methods. And we found also, with the help of the simulation models, an upper bound and a lower bound of an unbiased relation between income equivalence and supply with the urban green space. That is the middle. We took the middle for our analysis, which is the black line in the picture below. What does these black line tell us? I have to explain it a little bit for non-economists. If there is zero, if you are at zero with regarding to green space supply, then you would pay, or the income would be, the income proxy would be about near to 300 euro, what you would pay for an additional hectare of urban green that is done, the first one around your living place. And if you are provided with about 100 hectare, then it's enough for you. You get no additional life satisfaction, and therefore no additional income equivalence if there is an additional hectare. And how do we calculate it? Normally it's calculated at welfare values, but we calculate it to be in line with the accounts on the basis of exchange values. And this is what is named total value of urban green for one household. For one household which has a provisioning level of 55 hectare, then he would pay about 120 hectare for 120 euro for an additional hectare. And this is for us the simulated price for an additional hectare. And we multiply this with the 55 hectare that is around him. This was done for everyone, more or less everyone in Germany. And the values of these hectares from each kind of man and woman was then aggregated. Okay. What was the results? The overall average of green space supply is 75 hectare, and it goes from 104 hectare for small municipalities to 58 hectare for great cities, for large cities. And the average price for 1 hectare paid by all people living in 1 kilometer around this hectare would be a total value of 68 euro per year. No, it was this is the individual. The individual value is 68 euro per year, and it begins with 42 from small countries and ends up at 160 for large cities. And when these numbers are then aggregated about all people living in 1 kilometer distance around these green spaces. Then we find values, land values based on this method that are quite higher than the land prices for housing development. We are still working on this analysis. It wasn't very easy to do it, and there may be some calculation problems still in that, but what we find that the values of urban green are normally quite higher than the land price for this, for the same place, the land price to make some housing development. Yeah. The last slide should also indicate ways how to allocate this one value to the different services. One way would be to ask people to attach relative weights to the different services, 10%, 80%, or something like that. And then allocate the one number on the basis of these relative weights. Another methodology would be to see these value as a residual, then or as a total value. I showed you the different services that are valued, that are likely to be valued with this method, and therefore, if we have results on the value for about air filtering, local climate regulation, and recreation, etc., then we could subtract these special values from the total value found with the life satisfaction method, and the residual would be then the amenity value, whatever this is. Okay, thanks a lot.
So thank you very much for your nice presentation. I'm going to summarize again as before a couple of the questions that we had. So we had David Barton and Graciela Roche concerned about socioeconomic equity and environmental justice, so going beyond reducing inequality. And also the idea by David Barton, the question was if income life satisfaction substitution, more precisely, if there's a plateau for life satisfaction increase with the income, or is it roughly linear? Or what is the impact of that on income distribution across the city? And in the same line, I want to add a question by myself, just a clarification question. That's why I added to see if maybe other people have the same doubt. So your model assumes that green space increases life satisfaction, and life satisfaction increases your income. So this way would imply that when you increase green space, you're increasing inequality because you're increasing more income. So that's all these interrelations I think are interesting, and I would like you to please develop them. Thanks.
These were a lot of questions. Let me.
Well, it's basically the idea, the relationship with income inequality of your methods.
Yeah. The function you see here, the demand function, is an average demand function. And we valued green spaces only with these average demand function. If you would try to value it with a demand function of special people, you would get different results. You would get the result that would be best to increase green space where the people live with the highest income. For they have normally higher preferences measured as willingness to pay for green space only because they have more money. But we don't think that we want to use this these outcomes also for planning purposes. And it's not a planning purpose to give the most income, the people with the highest income, more real income by green space, and therefore we applied at any case this average function.
So thank you. Then the second question that we have is by Colin Smith, and it's actually quite a long question. And I think maybe if Colin is available, it would be good. Could you ask the question yourself, because I have kind of difficulties summarizing it.
It was more of a comment, and I think you kind of partly covered it, Card, at the end. I mean, I think in practice there may not be, or in principle there may not be much overlap between some of these regulating services, but it depends how they're measured. And the point is really, I think what you made at the end, that if in doubt, you can subtract them from your bigger bundled value, because part of the purpose of doing the ecosystem accounting is to identify individual services rather than lump everything together. So I think we need to sort of take things on a case-by-case basis, but it'd be helpful if there was sort of more guidance on that kind of question in the SEEA.
Yeah. They don't deal much with this overlapping there, but I think the problem is that the knowledge about the overlapping is not high, and if we would compare A, B, for instance, then we could also come to some better results with regard to overlapping or not overlapping between the different services. I have the impression that our method really measures, or it comes to very high values, that it really measures more or less all of these services. But it will be an interesting result then. We are so far to give an answer to it.
So thank you. I think that there are no other questions right now in the chat. So if there's anyone who would like to raise a question, please go ahead. If not, well, then we will move on to the next speaker, which would be David Batten on the evaluation of regulating.
Thank you. So for the final presentation today, I'm going to focus on a specific application of valuation of regulating services of urban trees in Oslo. I'm going to try to connect the information about tree asset mapping to valuation of regulating services, and work, excuse me, this work could not have been possible without the work of colleagues in NINA, in particular Zofie Simburova and Frank Hansen, regarding remote sensing, tree canopy modeling, and running of the iTree Echo valuation model. So the case study we have, and you see here on the left-hand side is an overview of the built zone in Oslo and the Oslo fjord. And the areas in color are city districts in the suburban area of the built zone, and which is typically small semi-detached housing, where there exists a regulation to stop, or at least to require permits to fell large trees above 90 centimeters in circumference of breast height. Accounting work we did on trees using laser data, which I'll come briefly to, showed that there is a large change in the inventory of large trees in some of these city districts, which reflects, let's say, the popular worry and this regulation that was implemented by the Planning and Building Agency in Oslo. So this is a specific case looking at the use of accounts of tree or tree asset accounts in a specific part of the city, which is a policy focus, looking at slowing down the loss of large trees due to densification, property development, infill. This work was based on the use of laser data from flyover LiDAR data, in which the laser points were reflected off surfaces you see on the right-hand side here, including buildings and trees. The data sets we had from the municipality were from 2011, 14, and 17. The laser points reflecting trees were extracted from the background reflections of the ground and buildings to identify trees and then identify the change in tree canopy cover. The LiDAR classification varied between these years, and so there's some uncertainty in the gains and losses. But for the future of this example, I'm going to assume that the LiDAR detection is accurate for the purposes of demonstrating how to value these changes. But it's important to say that this is ongoing work in improving LiDAR, use of LiDAR detection of trees, both in its resolution and also in how trees are classified. But if we assume then that the detection between 2011 and 17 is accurate enough for the purposes, then what we see is just as expected by the regulation, that there's a seeming large loss of, or a loss of large trees above about 10 meters height, but there's a large addition or gain of smaller trees below 10 meters of height. And this is what we work with to look at the asset account. So if we convert this to an extent condition table, similarly along the lines of what we discussed in the introduction, if you think of extent accounting as accounting tree crown cover, then that's one part of the table. And if you consider condition or height of trees as an element of the condition of tree crown cover, then this table is in a way a hybrid extent condition account for the peri-urban, suburban area of this regulation planning area. And we see just a repetition of the previous data, where there's an addition of small trees and a loss of larger trees, with a net increase of 361 decad, or 361,000 square meters of tree canopy cover, but the actual increase in tree canopy cover does not reflect, or rather the net increase doesn't reflect the distribution in the type of trees being lost and gained. In order to value the changes in this loss and gain of small and large trees, we've used the I-tree echo model, which is developed by the US Forestry Service. This is work done by Zofie Simbudova, my colleague. The I-tree echo model uses characteristics of physical characteristics of trees, including tree species, stem diameter, crown diameter, tree height, and height to crown base, and information on the context of land, the context of the tree, land use, the tree crown light exposure, the distance to buildings and direction to buildings, and also an assessment of the condition of the tree in terms of whether it has a full geometric crown or is the percentage missing. And this data is plugged into a model which summarizes a large body of research on tree characteristics and tree function, ecosystem service delivery. Background data that's needed is precipitation and air pollution levels, and what the model produces is a suite of ecosystem service outputs, looking at stored and sequestered carbon, avoided runoff, also disservices like volatile organic gas emissions, pollution removal, including the main components of air pollution due to vehicles and fuel burning in cities, energy effects regarding energy savings, cooling, and also it outputs some structural value compensation value estimates, which we don't use in this particular application. In this application, which I'm going to talk about now, we used all the ecosystem service outputs of I-tree energy effects, pollution and removal, carbon and hydrology effects. The input data to the I-tree model, it started with the characterizations available in the municipal I-tree, so the municipal tree inventory. This was augmented with GIS and statistics, including the LiDAR detection of tree crowns, which I mentioned earlier, the identification of building positions in relation to tree crowns, terrain map and land use map, and statistical analysis was used to make full advantage of this data to augment the amount of, or the number of trees that could be used into the model. About half of the trees in the municipal inventory had sufficient data to be used in the modeling. The outputs of the I-tree model for an average tree look something like this. In summary, the largest effect is on air pollution removal in value terms. Runoff, carbon sequestration, and energy building savings are a minor part of the value. And I'll come to in a minute to the assumptions about the pricing. But the model also outputs the physical units, which can be used or compiled in physical supply, ecosystem service supply tables. And then these are scaled by the prices for the services. I'll mention in a moment that we adjusted the prices to Norwegian conditions and some of the issues relating to this adjustment. If you run I-tree without any further ado, then you use default prices from the US. So some pretty important issues in adjusting the accounting prices that are delivered by I-tree to Norwegian conditions. Regarding air pollution mitigation, it was a similar, or rather it was, there was a choice between using default functions based on population density from the US, which are based on epidemiological studies, or using actual Norwegian estimates of the avoided health damage costs from different pollution components. We chose to go with this latter option. So we used non-population density estimates of health pollution mitigation or air pollution mitigation values for Norwegian cities, not accounting for variation in population exposure. We didn't account for the trends in air pollution, which Colin mentioned. Regarding carbon sequestration, we use the same approach as in the UK, looking at the cost of Norway achieving its emission target reductions. These could change, which means that the prices would have to be revised. Regarding energy savings from buildings, we looked at the electricity price, but the I-tree also looks at the carbon footprint of the energy used, and we have to look at the fossil fuel component of electricity imports. Sorry, the fossil fuel component of electricity imports, and then price those according to prices of CO2. And finally, regarding stormwater runoff reduction, we adjusted or we used the price for additional sewage treatment costs caused by combined sewage overflow of flooding events and the net effect of trees on that. We looked at the current cost of additional costs of sewage treatment overflow, but if you look at the future costs projected with climate change, they can be as much as 5.5 times higher than the current costs. So potentially the stormwater runoff reduction estimates in our work are very conservative, very low. We used a 2% risk-free social discount rate that's normal in public accounting in Norway, but that does not account for the very low interest rates that we're currently seeing when we compute asset values, and that's an interesting discussion that we might want to have at the end of the day. In order to extrapolate all of the values from I-tree for municipal trees to all trees in the city, we generated a machine learning model based on the municipal tree value, value of the municipal trees, and then used this model to scale up, adjusting for tree conditions and pollution zone to the whole city. This is a non-parametric machine-learned model. Modeled in a Bayesian belief network. I won't spend more time there, but it's been published and I can send you the links for that. When you do this value generalization using the, let's call it an I-tree emulation model, then you can predict the asset value of each tree that's been identified with LiDAR in the built zone, and summing of all the ecosystem services modeled by I-tree for all the 400,000 tree crown objects, you get an asset value, a total asset value of 5.4 billion krona roughly. There's some uncertainty, of course, to this estimate, which we need to publish on, but I haven't included that here. We also use this model to connect or to connect the values to the specific tree heights in the extent condition table. So we use the same model again, where we only adjusted for pollution zone and tree height. In the suburban area, we're all in the lowest pollution zone, and then we used the calculated asset value in the machine learning model for different tree heights to compute the monetary asset value table, which we see here. Between 2011 and 2017, we see an increase in asset values for small trees, a decrease in asset values for the large trees, as we saw in the extent condition accounting table. But interestingly, the net effect of the loss of large trees and the gain of small trees is actually positive. There's a 50 million krona asset value increase for regulating services as observed by I-tree, which means there's a net gain in the tree asset value. And this is in some ways perhaps counterintuitive to the policy interest, looking at the worry about the loss of large trees. But if we go back to the map on the distribution, the red areas are where there's a net loss of tree canopy cover, and the green areas where there's a net gain. So the losses and gains concealed in this aggregate number are distributed across the city. And indeed, in some neighborhoods, they might experience net loss of regulating services, while in others there's net gain. So this is a call, or rather an emphasis on the importance of using maps in addition to accounting tables to report in ecosystem accounting, look at distributional impacts. This slide is to remind us that when we look at ecosystem extent condition, service delivery, and use of services in cities, this is of course spatially heterogeneous and distributed across different social groups which live in different areas of the city. When doing this kind of work at a national accounting level, this is all grouped into one sector, which is called households. But obviously when we work with this at the city and sub-city scale, we see distributional impacts, which when doing urban ecosystem accounting could be augmented by subdividing households into socio-demographics, for example. And that was the sum of my presentation. And I'd like to again acknowledge the work of my colleagues in MAIA for making this work possible with this fine resolution. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, David, for this nice presentation. So we have one question by Graciela Rush. So given that there's a high variability among trees in terms of their traits characteristics that are linked to the generation of ecosystem services, is it meaningful to calculate an average ecosystem service value per tree? And you mentioned the big changes in the tree age size, for instance. Will this average capture these changes? So concerned about using averages in this presentation.
Yeah, so definitely the use of average tree values is would not do justice to the detailed modeling of tree characteristics in the extent condition account. But what we do then with using the I-tree Echo model is we compute an individual, I-tree Echo computes an individual annual value of ecosystem services for each single tree in the management area. And then we discount those flows to a net present value and asset value. And then we use this emulation model, which kind of captures the variation in I-tree Echo. We use it to generalize to all trees in the city, but taking account of the main characteristics of the individual trees, which are driving the difference in ecosystem service delivery. So we don't actually use an average value. We use a tree-specific value, at least for categories of trees, when we extrapolate. So I hope we address some of your concern.
So very related, a question by Colin Smith. Is growth of trees over the asset life reflected in changing regulating services over time and reflected in the asset value? So where you take into account the growth?
Yes, the growth of trees is well, that, you know, that's a probably, actually I'd have to say no. There are very detailed allometric equations on the trees when iTree is computing them, but iTree computes them for the current state of the trees. So there's not a tree inventory growth model baked into this when we then predict the future value of the whole tree population. What we could say is that since we have all ages of trees in our inventory, we're assuming that the age structure of trees will continue to be the same into the future. There'll be no structural differences in the age structure when we predict the asset value. But as we saw, there is a structural change in the tree inventory with large trees disappearing and small trees being planted, so that's a fine-tuning of the work that we need to do. So it was a good question.
Thank you. So I have also a question by Kaya Oras. So the question is, as urban ecosystems contribute to the welfare value in a direct way, one question is how to integrate these welfare values in urban ecosystem accounts in an SNA compatible way. The values generally do not account found in national accounts. So how to up these welfare-based values, measured, for example, using continuing evaluation and choice experiments, and other measured using market exchange-based values. So this is a question, of course, addressed to David, but more generally can be answered by any other speakers, because now we're already kind of at the end.
Yeah, that's great. I'd be happy if other people would chime in. In my experience, working with a municipality, and first of all, you have to convince them that computing values of trees in monetary terms is of use at all. And I find them less concerned with the compatibility of welfare-based values versus exchange values. I think more in the terms of providing a suite of value indicators which illuminate different sides of values conferred to trees by households, by business, by the public sector. And you have to use different valuation methods, both welfare-based and exchange value-based, to do that. So I would say that it's a judicious combination when you're trying to affect policy.
So we still have another question by Vasila Rush. I would guess that the tree growth would be included in the carbon sequestration model.
I have to, tree growth is included in the carbon sequestration model, yes. So there are predictive equations within iTree Echo to do that. But I would have to double check whether those same assumptions are applied across all the other ecosystem services, and I doubt they are. One disadvantage of the iTree Echo model in communication is that it's a state-of-the-art model, but in some sense it combines so much scientific work on tree functions that they are not immediately available. The assumptions in this model are immediately available when communicating the results. So on the one hand, they package everything so municipalities themselves can implement the model. On the other hand, it's somewhat of a black box when it comes to tweaking the assumptions.
So thank you. We have no further questions right now. So we'll then just briefly summarize and make maybe on my own to open a little bit for the last debate. So what we have seen different methods applied in different areas. So there's coming up again and again, there's a need to clarify which of these methods are accounting compatibility and which ones not. it is also has been raised several times that maybe for policymakers that's not the first question. It has had a lot of debate in the scientific realm, but maybe not so important for policymakers. Although I would argue, of course, if you give values which are not very clean, that at the end it can be against the credibility of those values. So so we need, but there's also a debate that we need clearly to make these values available, not only on a one-shot, but on a yearly basis or every 5 years or something like that. So we create a periodicity, because then maybe that helps policymakers to use these values. Because now we have seen, I think this is not only urban areas, it's very general. We don't see that they're used as much as we would like. Probably it's because we don't have yet a periodicity that makes it useful to use them. And then a more precise question that I was really surprised, and it comes also kind of a summary. So you, David, and when you presented your work for Oslo, you had for the trees there, air pollution was about 95% of the value that you obtained. That means that cultural services are not very important according to your study. And yet in other places, we have seen that cultural services are very important for not for a specific tree, but for green areas, which at the end have mostly trees. And then actually also, if you take a hedonic pricing, it would be very surprised that the method of air pollution that you measured are actually included in a hedonic pricing valuation, because hedonic pricing takes into account what people perceive that benefits the value of their house, and air pollution control through trees is probably not the best case. So I would think that there's still some effort to need to show clearly what is the most important one of these methods, and maybe for that there is some need to homogenize a little bit the way we proceed. Because now we have different messages coming out, I would suggest. I don't know if you have anything to react on that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I probably didn't say clearly enough that the demonstration of this asset valuation accounting was limited to regulating services captured by iTree Echo, which doesn't include any cultural ecosystem services. So it's a very good point. It was mainly my concern was, or rather interest with the case, was to demonstrate how you could link high resolution extent condition accounts with the valuation. This is of course very challenging, even more challenging perhaps for the cultural services.
Can I chip in on that, David, just to clarify that street trees are not really driving any of the values in the experimental accounts in the UK, and this is a key gap, because there's a lot of street tree planting going on, and clearly, yeah, the regulating. So my sense is that they're not, just in the sort of quantum of tree canopy cover, they're not going to be as important as the trees in kind of congregated areas. But there'll be a visual amenity element to it as well. So that's a gap. But yeah, having clarity on the different services is important.
But Colin, could I just ask, is there enough resolution in the air quality modeling, the national one you did, to pick up the street trees?
No, and this goes back to, I think almost you need a different model at that street level. The modelling works because it's looking at woodland and small woodland, so trees together, and you can kind of turn it on and off. I mean, the researchers at SEEA, it's a state-of-the-art model, but I can't speak to all the technicalities of it, but it doesn't quite work. It's not the right tool at that local level. So maybe iTree is the tool you would need to pick that up. Obviously, you'd need to then kind of ensure you've got consistent kind of valuation approach to them.
So, well, I don't know if there's any other comment or question that anyone wants to raise. If not, I think, yeah, David, see you are almost about to say something.
Well, before you close the meeting, I would, as somebody who's tried to help organize it, I would like to express my great thanks to all the presenters for showing both the complexity and opportunities of urban ecosystem accounting. And I loved the way you also all made it focused on how this can be used by municipal planners and policymakers, and the challenges we still face in making it useful. And also want to thank the people providing the comments and apologize for not getting to all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much from my side, everyone here, for attending, for presenting your questions, for patiently waiting until the end of our seminar. I think it was a very interesting set of presentations, so a special thanks to all the presenters. And well, as you know, our series of webinars in the MAIA continues, so please keep tuned to our webpage because we will have another set of interesting webinars, I hope. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending and presenting.